Mourik is Professor of Economics at Maastricht School of Management, where he teaches our Master in Management students, our MBA students of the residential programs and of the global programs abroad. Since 2003, Professor van Mourik is guest professor of the economics of EU integration at the Catholic University in Leuven. In addition to his teaching activities at MSM, he is also the academic coordinator and he's discipline head of economics and international business. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Aad van Mourik.
Thank you very much, Marielle. I've been asked to prepare a session with you on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the euro area, the Euroland economy. Here is what I have in mind to do. A little list of topics that I'd like to address. First, I start with some figures and take a look at some important macroeconomic variables and see how they are impacted by the COVID crisis. So this is a very relatively short story. Then to see what's going on at this moment, the current discussion that's taking place on the European Commission's proposal for a recovery fund, I take you back a few years to the origin of the monetary union, and also to the crisis that occurred, the financial crisis in 2008 and 9, and the sovereign debt crisis, the Greek crisis, as it's also called, of 2009 to 2012. And then I'll talk about the European Commission's recent proposal for a recovery fund, and I'll draw some conclusions about the desirability or the suitability of this recovery fund. And we finalize with some conclusions. So let's start with first a few figures on the impact of the COVID crisis on the economies of the EU member states. I'll take a look at a few macroeconomic variables. Here is gross domestic product, the volume of production in the member states. And you can see here the figures for 2019, 20, and 21. And on the left side of the page, we see the Euroland countries, all countries that have adopted the euro. And then on the right-hand side, there's countries that are supposed to adopt the euro or have not adopted the euro because they have a derogation. Now let's take a look at the left column, because this is where most of our discussion is going to be about today. You see that the impact of the crisis is quite drastic. On average, in Euroland, muted everybody, but you see here the impact of the crisis, the pandemic, on production volumes in the EU member states. On average, the euro area has a reduction in production of 7.7%, and we also see that some member states are particularly hard hit. Take a look at Greece, Spain, Italy. These are all member states that are very hard hit. France to a lesser extent, and then more successful economies like Luxembourg are relatively modestly hit with like 5 to 7% reduction in production. Then here is a slide that shows investment. Investment is always an interesting variable because jobs are created because companies are investing. And you see here that investment in some countries is reacting very, very strong. Take a look at Greece again, minus 30%, Spain minus 50%. And so we see that investment is hit particularly hard. Again, in the southern economies, a bit harder than in the northern economies, the more successful economies. Here is a look at the unemployment rate. You see that the unemployment rate, again, in the southern Mediterranean economies are are rising very sharply in double digits, whereas in other countries, take a look at Netherlands, it will go up from 3.4 to 5.9, Germany 3.2 to 4.0, compared to Greece and Spain, which as in the case of Greece and Spain hits almost 20%. 4% is a relatively a modest increase in unemployment. Then here is the budget deficit of the government. We again see that the budget deficits increase dramatically. Again, in the southern economies, the reduction in the budget surplus or the increase in the deficit is quite tremendous. Take again a look at Greece, Spain, France, Italy, significant increases in the budget deficit. And so this is another consequence of the crisis. And then finally, let's take a look at government debt, which is next to the deficit, a variable that economists are always interested in. And again, we see that Greek debt, which was already very high, almost 180%, is now skyrocketing to 196%. Spain has an increase in debt rate that's significant, 20 percentage points. France, same story. And the average for the euro area is an increase from 86 to 102%. You see that debt rates also increase in countries like Netherlands or Germany. And so everybody is facing significantly higher debt rates in the present budget year. So let's take a look at how the EMU was created, because we want to understand what's going on at the moment, and we want to understand the discussion that's taking place in Europe at the moment about how to react to the COVID crisis. And so I take you back a few years to the origins of the monetary union, the economic and monetary union. And so, but before I do so, here is a PowerPoint that I found in a relatively recent publication from the European Commission. It rates member states on one dimension. Are you in favor of fiscal transfers or fiscal discipline? And then the Commission makes a distinction between the North and the South. And you see that northern countries, Netherlands is on top, Germany is number 3, Finland number 2. Northern countries generally tend to favor fiscal discipline, balanced budgets, don't borrow too much. And southern member states, like on the bottom you see France, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Belgium, tend to favor fiscal transfers. So if you could choose between fiscal discipline or a transfer from other member states, then these countries on the left side the South countries, as they're called here, would favor fiscal transfers. Now that will turn out to be an interesting graph, because we'll come back to it a bit later. So let's take a look at how the monetary union was created. The union started in the monetary union in 1999, as you know, and in the decade before, the architecture of it was created. The Maastricht Treaty introduced the idea of a monetary union, single currency in Europe, and basically what happened was, in the early 1990s, when the monetary union was envisaged in the Maastricht Treaty, it was basically an idea that had strong German roots. And Germany, since the end of World War II, has always been very strong in price stability. The German economy always had the lowest inflation after World War II ended. And the Germans had an extraordinary amount of fiscal stability. So if the German government wanted to build a hospital or roads for its citizens, it would first tax the citizens, then spend the money. Other countries, southern countries, usually had different ideas of fiscal stability, and they would first build a hospital, so to speak, and then worry about who's going to pay for it. But in Germany, fiscal stability, balanced budgets, or small budget deficits have always been a very important part of economic policy, and low inflation rates were also a typical characteristic of German economic policy. And when the idea of the monetary union came up, the Germans were basically able to push through their idea that macroeconomic stability is an issue of price stability and fiscal stability. And so they made sure that this was written into the Maastricht Treaty. And so the Maastricht Treaty then decided or said that the price stability task was the responsibility of the European Central Bank, and it would have to create low inflation for the euro area. And then fiscal stability was the task of the individual member states. So each member state would be responsible for its own spending and its own taxation of its citizens. And then the treaty also defined a maximum for the government deficit and a maximum for the debt. So if member states wanted to join the euro land, they could have a maximum budget deficit of 3% of gross domestic product, and their debt rates were not supposed to be higher than 60%. Now, of course, Germany was very afraid that member states, once they were in the monetary union, would no longer obey these maximum numbers. And so a stability and growth pact was created, which was an arrangement that basically would force member states to comply with the budget rules and the debt rules in the future. So now, what happened then in 1999, when the euro was introduced, member states gave up their exchange rate or their interest rates, if you want. So you cannot influence your economy by changing the exchange rate or the interest rate. That was the prerogative of the European Central Bank, and so the national central banks lost a very important instrument of economic policy. Now imagine then that your economy goes into recession. Then how can you solve the problem? Well, there were basically two instruments that were important, considered important. One was labor market flexibility. So imagine that unemployment is going up because you're hit by recession. Well, if wages would go down, then the demand for labor would increase and your unemployment problem would diminish. Or if workers were very flexible, they could move to other member states where employment was strong, and so your unemployment rate would, in that case, also go down. Then fiscal policy was still possible, so member states could tax and spend, or spend in this case of a recession, and then spend your way out of the crisis. Now, it's interesting then to see what happened, because member states have a very bad record in the area of labor market flexibility. I'll come to that in a second. And so if labor market flexibility is basically absent, then the only thing you have when there is a crisis is national fiscal policies, budgetary policies. So let's take a look at the next slide then, where I characterized member states on two dimensions. First, what is the chance that you're hit by what we call an asymmetrical shock? So let's say there's a recession that only hits you. That's what we call asymmetrical. Symmetrical shocks are never interesting, or well, never interesting, are not so interesting, because if there is a symmetrical shock, the central bank would lower the interest rates or do something else, and then everybody would benefit from this. But the problem of the monetary union is asymmetrical shocks. Let's say Portugal is hit by a recession and the other states are booming. Well, then Portugal would benefit greatly if it had a flexible labor market. For instance, workers would be willing to accept pay cuts, or workers would move to other member states, or workers who are very much willing to accept a different type of jobs. Let's say you are an academic and you're fired, and you would be willing to become a plumber or a carpenter because there's jobs in that sector. Well, that would help, of course, to lower the unemployment rate. Now, obviously, if you look at this table, then the most pleasant corner to be in is the one where you have low chance of an asymmetrical shock, but you have a high degree of labor market flexibility. So that's the upper right-hand side corner. And you find countries there like Netherlands, Germany, Austria, Slovakia, Poland, Czech Republic, Denmark, which I colored red because they're not a member of Euroland. And then the most unpleasant corner to be is where you have a high probability of an asymmetrical shock and low degree of labor market flexibility. That's what we find in the lower corner on the left side. And if you take a look at who we meet there, then it's countries like Greece, Sweden, Finland, Spain, Cyprus, and Malta. And then also an unpleasant corner is the one on the right hand side in the bottom, where you find countries like France, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, Bulgaria, and Romania. And then actually you might say that the upper two corners, left and right, are actually the most pleasant ones to be in, with high being the number 2 after low high. And so you see that if we look at the lower two corners, there's quite a few countries that have a serious problem with labor market flexibility. Their labor market is not flexible. And so the only way then to deal with the crisis is to spend your way out of it. So let's take a look at the crisis of 2008-9, the financial crisis, as we call it, and the aftermath, which was another crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, as we call it, or the Greek debt crisis. Let's take a look at what happened there. The high private and public debts. I'll take you to the next slide and then come back to this one in a second. If you take a look at the left-hand side graph, you see that Greece, Italy, Portugal, France, Spain had rising debt levels, and these debt levels became very, very high. So the Greek debt level of 180% is significantly higher than the German debt level, which is well below 100%. The German debt levels went up briefly in 2008, 9, 10, and then it persistently declined. And you see that in other countries, Portugal, Spain, Greece, Italy, this took much longer before any improvement set in, if it set in at all. Then, hold on, I need to take you back. But, okay, yes. And then a second problem that happened was there were large current account surpluses and deficits. Germans, Dutch, the Danes persistently exporting more than importing, and that was a sign of an imbalance in the euro area. You see that countries like Greece, Spain, Italy have persistent deficits in their trade, and so that was another problem. Then I'll take you back to the next slide again, because there we see a dramatic capital flight happening in some countries. Again, the southern Mediterraneans, Spain, Greece, Portugal, Italy, as you can see in the middle graph, were witnessing serious amounts of capital flight. So capital was leaving these economies because the financial markets didn't trust what was going on there. And then my slide got stuck. Then there were structural weaknesses inhibiting economic growth. I'll take you to the next slide again. And here you see that countries like Greece, Spain, Italy, France have had a very poor record in economic growth. And if you compare that to Germany, you see a dip in production, but the Germans fairly quickly recovered from the crisis. So then we see an increasing amount of non-performing loans. So banks having loans of which they're not certain that they can be paid back. Now, this is a big problem because if a bank has too many non-performing loans, the bank might go bankrupt. And you and I have bank accounts in these banks. and we might lose our money. So non-performing loans were very big problematic issues. And then we see sharp increase in interest rates in these in the countries. And then we saw what was called the sovereign bank doom loop. Banks have a lot of, let's say you're a Greek bank, you have a lot of Greek government debt. Now, if financial markets believe that the Greek government can't pay back the debt, that means that banks who possess that debt are also going to be in trouble. Of course, the government has an interest in saving these banks. And so they were embracing each other in a deadly embrace, a very dangerous situation. And then it was clear that some states, like the ones in the south, were not obeying the fiscal rules, and also were not introducing any measures, structural policy measures, as we say, that would improve the flexibility of the labor market. And so back then in 2012-13, there were serious fears that the Greek crisis would also infect Portugal, Spain, Italy, Cyprus, and Ireland. And if that would have happened, the very existence of the euro area might have been in danger, very much in danger. And so here we have one graph that I didn't show you, but which shows you how much interest rates diverged. The blue line is the German interest rate, which was very low. And then we have, you see that the interest rate in Germany even went below zero. And then we see that the red line was the crisis countries, the four countries I just mentioned, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And a very important moment was 2012. You see that the interest rate in those countries started to decline again. And that was after Mario Draghi, the president of the central bank, announced that the central bank would do anything within its power to save the euro. And that made that financial markets regain trust in the euro, and then interest rates in the countries in Southern Europe went down again. So many other measures were taken since then. So countries introduced reforms. So they cleaned up the banking system. Non-performing loans had to be addressed. Banks needed to keep more capital. And then a banking union was created. So the European Central Bank became the single supervisor of all big banks in Europe. And that was arranged nationally before the sovereign debt crisis. But after that, the central bank, the ECB, became the sole supervisor of banks. And there was a single rule book, as it was called, and a common resolution framework, which meant that if a bank would go into trouble, shareholders would also be forced to pay a part of the damage. And then the most contentious element of the banking union was the common deposit guarantee. So what was introduced after the trouble started was, in all countries of the European Union, a deposit guarantee of 100,000 euros. So if you have a bank account with less than 100,000 euros, that would be a deposit guarantee. That would be a deposit guarantee of maximum 100,000 euros. That meant a very good situation for the customers of these banks, of course. Problem is that these deposit guarantees are guarantees from the national governments, and so this is not a European deposit guarantee. And a lot of the discussions we are having at the moment are: should this be a European deposit guarantee system, a European deposit guarantee system? So an Italian bank goes bankrupt, and then all European countries come to the rescue of the depositors and guarantee the 100,000 euros. Then a European stability mechanism was created, the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, and that was a bailout fund. a bailout fund which contained something like 500 billion euros that could be used if situations like the one in Greece would happen, or if banks needed to be recapitalized. The ESM could be involved, and that would then prevent further trouble. Then the central bank, ECB, has started a program of quantitative easing. So it has been buying government debt in secondary bond markets since September 2012, and that's also called the OMT program, the outright monetary transactions program. And then the rules on fiscal stability were strengthened. So a fiscal compact, as it was called, was introduced that obliges member states in principle to write into their laws that the budget should be balanced. And then finally, a surveillance mechanism was introduced, a scoreboard with scoreboard indicators in which member states are rated how they're doing on various elements of their economic performance. Then, if you look at the situation before COVID-19 came, then many people would argue that there was an unsustainable equilibrium. The banking union is incomplete, and capital market union is incomplete, and then there's insufficient adjustment mechanisms, and there's no central fiscal stabilization function, and then there's problems with accountable institutions and effective governments. I'll say a few words about all these four problem areas. We start with the banking union. So we already said a true European deposit insurance is the only way in which the banking union could go. But you can, of course, already see that this is very difficult to implement. Solidarity in Europe is not really very well developed. And, taxpayers in Northern European countries are arguing, why would we pay for problems with banks in Southern Europe that are not even under our supervision? So this is a very contentious issue. Certainly, if you remember that some countries, Italy, for instance, has a large amount of non-performing loans, and Italian banks have possess a lot of Italian government debt, and so this is a very difficult problem to solve, and it has not been solved before the pandemic started. Then, European capital markets are very underdeveloped. If you compare this with the United States, the situation is completely different. In Europe, banks play a big role in financial markets, in financing households and firms. When you need money, you go to a bank in Europe. Whereas in the United States, there's a single capital market covering the entire US of A. And so if you need money as a company, you go to the capital market, you issue shares. And so the situation there is quite different. Now, we have very fragmented capital markets in Europe that are, in addition, relatively small. And so the Americans have a big advantage over us because if, let's say, a crisis occurs, well, then shareholders will pay a part of the cost of this crisis. But whereas if banks have given loans, then the situation is much more problematic, because if a bank has many non-performing loans and is going bankrupt, the depositors will be the ones who suffer in principle. So that is much more dangerous situation. Now, the European Union is taking all kinds of measures to, let's say, to promote the functioning of capital markets, but this will take some time before we look like a US of A. Then there's insufficient mechanisms for structural adjustment, as we call it. Obviously, the way to go would be to have a market like you have in the US, a single market, for instance, for services or digital services. Take, for instance, the digital single market. You see big difference between us and the United States again. The Americans have one digital market. We have 28 or 27. You may have wondered why we have so many telecom providers, for instance. Well, every member state has like 3 or 4 telecom providers. Times 27 makes roughly 100 telecom providers, whereas in the US you have a handful. And so that market can benefit much more from efficiently functioning telecom providers. And so that makes the digital market completely different ball game in the United States. And so in Europe, we have a big agenda in making the single market complete. That's also something that does not go very fast. Then several member states have serious reform agendas. For instance, France has a reform agenda in pensions and labor market rules. Italy has a reform agenda in banks, its fiscal discipline, corruption is frequently cited. Spain has a problem with labor market rules, too much protection on the labor market. Belgium has a problem with trade unions, and so on. So there's a lot of countries that are in our 2 lower corners of the table that have serious reform agendas that are not really moving forward. And then there's no central fiscal stabilization policy. We saw in the tables that I showed you before that countries like France, Italy, Greece are hit much harder by the COVID crisis than northern countries. And there is no single budgetary policy in Europe that can lend assistance to these countries if that's necessary. And then if you add to that that these countries have problems with wage and price flexibility, problems with immobile labor, then it's very logical to say we need a bit more firing power on a central level in the European Union. So how could that firing power look like? We usually call it risk sharing. Well, there are some proposals which are very popular in France, which is to create a European finance minister with a full-fledged European area budget. So you have a federal budget in Europe that could be used to fight recessions in certain member states. There is suggestions that the European Stability Mechanism should be converted into a European monetary fund. It basically means beefing up the ESM. And then there's the idea, which we will talk about in a second, the idea of Euro bonds or Corona bonds, as they're nowadays called. We talk about that in a second. And there's ideas of better counter-cyclical stabilizers. So it could help, for instance, if there were an EU unemployment insurance scheme. Now, most of these proposals are usually from southern member states. France, Italy, Spain, Greece, etc. Northerners usually have problems with them. We'll come back to that in a second. Then we have the governance of the monetary union, the accountability, as I called it before, which was the fourth characteristic of an unstable equilibrium. Well, you just have to look at this slide. Don't even take this one serious. I copied this from a publication of the European Commission, but don't even look at it seriously, because you see that the relationships are extremely complex, and the governance of the monetary union is basically a horribly complicated thing, with a European Commission, European Parliament, national parliaments, finance ministries, European Central Bank, and so this is a horrifically complicated governance structure, and that needs to be changed, obviously. So let's then go to the European Commission's recent proposal for a recovery fund. In May, the European Commission came up with plans to fight the corona pandemic. And the first idea was, which was not so revolutionary, was to use the European Stability Mechanism money or the European Investment Bank to give loans to countries who need it, to save businesses and save the jobs for workers. Then the interesting part of the proposal, the most contentious part of it, is what was called Next Generation EU. which is a temporary EU recovery instrument, a one-off instrument, as the European Commission calls it, of 750 billion euros, of which 500 billion would be given away in grants to the most hard-hit member states. So that is Italy, Spain, Greece, and so on, and 250 billion in cheap loans. And that is the most contentious issue. We'll say a few words about it in a second. Then the Commission proposed an increase in the EU budget from 1.2% of GDP to 1.4%, with a temporary increase to 2%. And so this is the second contentious issue, but it's not as contentious as bullet point number 2. So Next Generation EU would allow the Commission to borrow up to 750 billion euros in the next budgetary period, 2021-2024, and it could pay back the bonds that would be taken from the market with new own resources. One is an emission trading system, good for 10 billion a year, a carbon border tax, and then the European Commission proposes to take away 3% of corporate taxation that is levied in the member states and allocate this to the EU, and then to introduce a digital tax on companies like Amazon, Facebook, etc., which would be good for another 1.3 billion per annum. And now, of course, the debt that would be taken, the bonds that would be taken from the market would be mutualized. So it's the responsibility of all the member states to pay them back, the collective responsibility, and that's what we call debt mutualization. And then also new taxation powers are quite a unique thing. The treaties, the European treaties, have always argued that taxation decisions are the prerogative of member states, and the European Union in principle is not supposed to tax. And so introducing taxation powers for the EU in the press was called crossing of the Rubicon. So it's a game changer. It would be a totally new situation. Now the Commission calls it, of course, temporary, one-off, or whatever you want to call it, the Corona bonds, but many people fear that this is, that temporary could, in practice, mean permanent. Now, is it a good idea for the Commission to have powers to help member states that are very hard hit? In Europe, we usually have a principle, or we usually invoke a principle that's called the subsidiarity principle. And the subsidiarity principle is written in the treaties, and it basically says that a task should, in principle, be done at the lowest level of government. So the lower the level of government, the better. And a task should be leveled up to a higher level of government if there's economies of scale or cross-border externalities. For instance, economies of scale means that a higher level of government can do it more efficiently, can do a task more efficiently, and externalities means that measures have cross-border effects. So now, obviously, externalities are clearly present in the COVID pandemic because it's in nobody's interest. Also not in the northern countries' interest that southern countries go bankrupt. If they're not able to pay back their debts, their government debts, then that has the potential to blow up the monetary union. And so the fact that the German government in May agreed with Corona bonds and taxation power for the EU level basically underscores that the Germans are very worried for the stability of the euro area. And this is why Chancellor Merkel has taken a decision to side with the southern economies, even though the Germans have for a long time resisted ideas of fiscal transfers. Now, there's also arguments to the contrary that you can hear. One argument is what we call preference costs. And you can say that if countries have different preferences for government policies, centralization will invariably result in preference costs, which means that some countries will say we do too much and others will say we do too little. And so everybody's unhappy about the measures that the central government takes. Then there's 4 countries that are called the frugal 4, the Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, and Denmark, who say, well, we oppose unconditional cheap loans and grants because this would basically invite moral hazard. If you know that somebody will come to your rescue when you have a problem, then you become less careful. And that's what we call moral hazard. And giving grants and cheap loans without conditions to these loans and grants would simply invite moral hazard. Then the frugal 4 feel that they're penalized for following the rules. They said, look, we have always kept our budget deficits low. We have introduced painful reforms of our labor markets. That's why our economies are doing better than the southern economies. In Spain, they still have labor market problems with the labor market rules. Italians have never tried to keep the budget below 3%. And so we did in the north, and now we're penalized for following the rules. And so the northern economies would say this undermines the stability of our economy if we are giving away grants and loans without conditions, because somebody has to pay the bill, and obviously the northern countries fear that they're going to be the ones, and they say, look, this makes no sense. It's like a swimming contest in which you are swimming on top, and then the ones who are not able to win seek to win by drowning the number one. And so the question is that wise policy? Then there may also be opposition from Eastern countries, the member states who joined in 2004, because normally money of the European budget is spent on the basis of GDP per capita. So the poorest member state gets most of the money. But in the Merkel-Macron plans for the Corona Rescue Fund, the money is spent on member states that are hardest hit. And the member states in Central and Eastern Europe have not been hit as hard as Italy or Spain by the COVID crisis. And so they fear they might lose out from the distribution of the money. Then there is a number of arguments that are used in the debate which I think are improper argumentation. One of them is the constant argument of solidarity. Northern Europe needs to show solidarity with Southern Europe. Well, obviously the opposite is also true. Southern Europe should also show solidarity by making its efforts serious to introduce structural reforms. Then there's an argument that we need to help in the north because the debt levels of Greece and Italy and so on are unsustainable. But that is an interesting argument. But that argument looks only at government debt. And you saw the government debt levels in one of the early slides, and you see there that Greece had like 180%. Now here is private debt, household debt. And then if you look at Greece, which we see here, then they have private households have something like 100% debt, and compare that to countries like Netherlands, which has well over 200, I think 262, if I remember well, percent household debt. And so if you would add private debt to government debt, the picture looks completely different than the one that I showed you at the beginning. Then there is an argument that Northerners are rich and Southerners are being poor. Well, this is also an argument that's subject to some qualification. I show you this slide here, which I took from OECD. And again, if you look at you can make some interesting comparisons here. Like here we have Spain, and wealth per adult person in Spain is roughly the same as wealth in Germany. And then, to our great surprise, we see that France has a higher wealth level than the Germans. So the French are richer in terms of wealth than the Germans. And so Netherlands here, wealth per person, per adult person, is less than Ireland, and than Italy. And so you can make many qualifications to statement that northern countries are rich and southerners are by definition poor. That argument is only valid to a limited extent. There's been some alternative proposals to the Commission proposal that have been floating around. Some people have said that we should go for the option of go it alone Corona bonds. You know, the southern economies could mutualize debt together, issue debt together, and leave everybody else out of it. Well, that's obviously a proposal that's not going to fly. Then a slightly different proposal is the proposal of the coalition of the willing, which would allow countries to opt out. So the fragile four could in principle opt out in this scenario from taking responsibility for issuing Corona bonds. That is also an option which is not going to fly because the fragile four have, even though they've been, keeping their resistance very stiff, also shown some elements of flexibility, and so this is also not likely to happen. You lose influence if you say no to a proposal that's accepted by almost everybody else. Then Paul de Grauwe, who is a colleague of mine from Leuven University, has come with the idea of helicopter money. He says, forget about issuing a Corona bonds, just spend whatever you want to spend to solve the pandemic cost. Each member state should spend during the pandemic crisis as much as you want, and it should be financed by the central bank, who directly finances the budget deficits. And de Grauwe believes that this is a good proposal because it means that government debt rates need not increase any further. And so the inflation risk would also be minimal because at the moment the economies are very depressed, as you saw, and so the inflation risk would be minimalistic. Now the problem is, of course, that the treaty forbids monetary financing, and so this proposal is also very likely not going to happen. So what could happen then in the end? Well, let's say a few concluding remarks. In the end, we'll probably see that the Commission's proposal is accepted, probably in a modified version. They'll probably give some reductions in the contribution, perhaps to the Netherlands and Austria and the other opponents. But that the proposal is accepted is widely believed at this moment. It's basically a political judgment call. We know the answer in 2-3 weeks, I think, whether it's going to fly, yes or no. Acceptance of the proposal, either in its original or in a modified version, would be very important because it would signal to financial markets that the euro is here to stay and that the member states will not tolerate a breakdown of the euro area. And so it would also give us some time to think about what's needed further in terms of institutional reforms and other economic reforms like structural adjustments or completion of the single market for services and the digital single market. So that would hopefully make us more resilient in the next crisis, and then we would have dealt with this crisis in the same way as we've always dealt with crisis in the European Union, which is what some newspapers call muddling through. All right, I give the floor to you for questions, and I'll stop my share here.
Questions came in. I'm sure you were able to see them yourself, or should I read them to you?
Yeah. Would you, I go to number 2 that I see here. Would you please suggest key areas of policies to developing countries to cope with the COVID-19 crisis? Well, I think there's no developing country that's the same. What's done in Europe is a lot of the money that's going to be or that's supposed to be invested, is saving companies, but then also in areas like investment in healthcare, health research, the digital single market, the environmental priorities. So the European Union tries to kill a few birds with one stone, because we want to be a fully green economy by 2050. The plans were produced last year, and they try to use this crisis to promote the green agenda of Europe. So this is a few areas where Europe is going to invest in. In developing countries, I think many of the countries that I'm familiar with have big problems in the area of healthcare, and so I could imagine that their most important spending would come in the form of beefing up the healthcare system. But that's something you don't do overnight, as we have seen also in Europe. So I hope that's a bit of an answer to your question. There is a question from Syed Mohammed Walid. Please kindly explain the proposed tax power again. Well, the European Union in principle has no taxation power. That's arranged in the treaty, the European treaties. So taxation is the prerogative of the member states. And so Europe cannot tax wages like member states. All member states tax wages. Europe cannot do this. And so if Europe is supposed to get taxation power, for instance, take 3% of the corporate taxes that are levied in the member states, then this requires a unanimity of all the member states. So everybody would have to agree with this. Now, once you give taxation powers, we know that it's very hard to get rid of them. So that is of course a big problem in the discussions. People are afraid, especially in northern countries, that if you give taxation powers to Europe, who knows what will happen? And so there's a lot of resistance to that. There is a question of why stock markets are not really hit. Well, stock markets probably are counting on an early reversal of the problem. You see, if you look at the production figures and the unemployment figures that I showed you at the beginning, then we see that the figures for 2021 are improving already. And so markets factor this in. So if you think the crisis is only temporary, oh, we're going to be hit this year, but next year everything's going to be fine again, then you will see that markets very quickly rebound. Whereas if you see in the last days, especially, that in the United States, the numbers are going up dramatically. I don't know if you've seen the comparison between EU and the US. And in EU, the COVID numbers are going down very strongly, whereas in the US, they're skyrocketing. And that will definitely have an impact on the markets in the US. You can be sure of that. Sooner or later, that's going to have serious consequences. Yeah, there's a question from the US. President Trump has been sending financial relief for individuals that lost their jobs called stimulus check, pandemic relief check. Is it the case in Europe? If not, is it possible? Well, and then there's an addition. It's essential to ensure strong recovery for all countries and thus make the euro area an attractive destination for investment. Well, there's one big difference, apart from the ones that we talked about in the presentation, between the US and Europe. And that is that social security in the euro area is much better arranged than in the United States. The US has given, I think it was $1,000 check to everybody. In Europe, we don't need this. We have unemployment compensation. When you're fired, it does not mean in most countries that you're not able to pay the rent anymore. Whereas in the US, when you lose your job, it could literally mean that you cannot pay the rent anymore next month. And so they expect a lot of people going to be evicted from their houses in the US because they can't pay the rent anymore. In Europe, that's very unlikely. So our social security system is a very powerful automatic stabilizer. The Americans don't want a system like this. So they have different preferences as far as this is concerned, but it means that they're hit much harder. The good side of it is, well, it's of course dramatic. If you lose your house and everything, is very harsh. For the American economy, the good side of it is that the American economy is flexible like hell. If you are an engineer and you lose your job in the US, you live in New York, tomorrow you'll work in California if that's what it takes to survive. Or you are an engineer in New York, you lose your job, you're going to fry hamburgers in the morning tomorrow with McDonald's, you're going to fry chicken legs with, what is it, Kentucky Fried Chicken in the afternoon, and you're going to pack bags at Walmart in the evening if that's what it takes to survive. It would be totally unthinkable in Europe that people would have 3 jobs to survive. So the social security in our countries is generally much more able to solve a part of your problem. Then I believe that all Americans got a $1,000 check, which is of course, well, let me put it like this. You might wonder if this is appropriate. Why give a check to somebody who doesn't need it or who doesn't need it as much? So you want to help the ones that are badly hit, and the ones that are not badly hit don't need any help. So that is, I think, what you could say. There's a remark that it's essential to ensure strong recovery for all countries to make the euro area an attractive destination for investment. I cannot agree more with you, Fatima. So that's a good remark. Do you agree with the government helping companies like Alitalia that has proved corruption problems, debts, etc.? Well, there's an interesting debate going on. Should you help no matter who knocks on your door? We had the same discussions in the Netherlands. For instance, we have companies that applied for government aid who have been giving bonuses to their managers, which is strange, right? Because the taxpayer will then say, look what I'm doing. I'm paying bonuses for company chief executives. It's ridiculous what we're doing. So yes, you could give a subsidy to Alitalia, but Alitalia has a dismal record of competitiveness. It's a company that has been in trouble well before the Corona crisis started. And the problems of Alitalia are 20 years old at least. And so, yeah, helping them to survive at this moment is I leave the conclusion to you, whether that's an idea, yes or no. Probably you would want to come up with conditions for helping those companies. We have a second round of government aid in the Netherlands now that is about to start, and the government is now attaching strings to that aid, conditions. And there are several companies who accepted aid in the first round of government aid who are now saying, oh, we don't want aid anymore because you attach conditions to it. That means you don't need the aid, right? So attaching conditions to the aid is, I think, very good thing. Do you think to make a single capital market at this stage of crisis will be fruitful? Or a single capital market cannot be created overnight. This is a thing that needs to grow, and it will take time. It would be lovely if we had one, but we don't. It's that simple. We have 27 different capital markets, which are small, basically not as effective as the big capital market you have in the US of A. And so that's going to take time. That's for sure. And then somebody else remarked, it's always good to have a developed capital market, be it right now or in the future. Yes, I cannot agree more with that. How has COVID-19 affected European banks, and what measures are in place to solve continental problems? Well, banks are in a better position than they were, let's say, 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So banks are supposed to keep more capital, which has been a very good development. And there's more supervision from the European Central Bank on our European banks, which is good news. But it's certainly well conceivable. This is what the whole discussion is now about the Corona Fund. Is that if banks in a country like Italy go bankrupt, there's a good chance that there's contagion to Spanish, Greek banks. If that happens, nobody can save the euro area. So you might say it like this: the euro area is still very fragile, and it's less fragile than 10 years ago, but it's still fragile, and it certainly could end with a drama if banks in countries like Italy go bankrupt. Look, if Cypriotic banks go bankrupt, in principle, that's not really a big problem. But if you talk about Italy, it's the fourth economy in the euro area. Spain is another big economy. Add Greece to it, and Portugal, and hell might break loose. So it's really important that we have measures in place like the Stability Fund and like the Corona Fund to save these companies if necessary. There are a few older questions. There's something strange here in Uganda, says Charlie from Uganda, where private companies are contributing to COVID assistance fund managed by the government, but at the same time laying off workers or paying salaries by half. What's your opinion about that? Well, it's good that private companies are voluntarily contributing. So that is the good side of the story, yes. That they're laying off workers is, in my opinion, something that we might see also here happening. If you can't pay the salaries anymore, that's where it ends, right? You cannot pay your workers. It's that simple. So it's tragic if people are fired. And then the only thing you can hope is that some kind of social security cushion exists. But I guess in Uganda, you don't really have this. So then basically you're on your own, like in the United States. It's bad luck. Same here in Nigeria, and there is why there are no benefits for some currencies in banks. I don't understand this question, so I'm not sure if I'm able to answer that one. All right. I think I went through basically most of the questions. Mariella?
There were a few older questions which came in during your presentation. And this is from a longer time ago, I think, so maybe you don't see them now, but I can read them out for you if you like.
Okay. Yeah. Give me two more.
Yeah. Well, actually, I got one question.
I can't hear you now.
I had one question, which were actually three questions. And the first question, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
The first question was, what could effective governance within the EU look like instead of the current ineffective governance?
Yeah, well, it's very clear that things need to change drastically. So, for instance, the European Parliament would need to be much more be able to act just like a parliament, which at the moment is basically a very ineffective parliament. Hardly anybody is taking part in European elections. They have a very low turnout. The power of the parliament is not like the power of a real parliament. If you look at the American Congress, for instance, the Congress has much wider powers than the European Parliament. And Congress in America can introduce taxation. Congress in America can introduce budget lines. They can say, we think the government should spend on 1, 2, 3. And so our powers of the European Parliament are much more limited. And so the Parliament would need to get a much more representative role. Then probably you would want to go to something like a federal budget in the European Union. So a central fiscal stabilization mechanism would not be a bad idea. But again, we're not going to go there overnight because it's very difficult to implement it. If there's not enough oversight, then how can you do this? So all these four problems or these four areas of instability are tied very much together. The solutions for all four problems need to come together. You can't just take one thing out and say, let's do something about structural problems and then leave the rest for our successors. So all these things need to be addressed. And the problem with Europe is, if you want to make major changes, you need to change the treaty. A treaty change always needs to be done with consensus. All the member states need to agree. One of them is enough to say no, and it won't happen. And there, for instance, you see the problem with taxation. One member state has veto power to stop it, European taxation. So you see where we need to make drastic changes which make, which sort of create much more like a governmental structure, a real governmental structure with real accountability in Europe. That was question number one.
Yeah, I posted another two in your chat box.
Mm-hmm. Okay, where do I find them? Oh yes, number 2 and 3. How political are the choices which have to be made in regard to risk? Oh, they're absolutely political. You can be sure that in the coming weeks, there's a lot of wheeling and dealing going on. And whether the fund will come, yes or no, is purely a political decision. And it's horse trading. So we agree with you, let's introduce the fund. Now, you know we are against this. Now, what can you offer me in return? France, you can be sure that this is the kind of discussion that's taking place. For instance, in the past few months before the COVID crisis, the Netherlands was criticized many times because we have a budget, a lower contribution to the budget. We get a rebate because we are net payers and we get a rebate. And other member states have said, we're sick and tired of this Dutch rebate and that has to stop. And then we said, of course, no, we don't want that to stop. And you can be sure that this issue is on the agenda. So, okay, France, we're going to agree with you guys, but then you let us keep the rebate. Something horse trading like that will go on. So that is entirely a political choice. And then you see that the power or the influence of the Netherlands has grown smaller dramatically because we had a powerful ally until recently, which has left the European Union on the 1st of January. And mostly we let unpopular decisions be promoted by the Brits. And now we're standing on our own, which is a bit awkward, but no, but that's the reality. ESM towards EMF, what would be the major steps that need to be taken towards EMF? Well, I think much more funding. So EMF would be funded much more seriously than the current EMS. It would have more possibilities to give you binding advice on how to rearrange your economic policies if you apply for support. The IMF can introduce serious conditionality. You can get loans and everything from the IMF, and they usually attach serious strings to it. And that would need to be done also in the European Monetary Fund framework. So then there's a question. COVID and the African economy. Somebody would like to have a lecture on challenges and opportunities. Well, I think, Mariella, that's what you have to arrange then, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
there's one question about what did most companies do with their private sector companies do with their profits pre-COVID. Well, pre and post-COVID, you can say this. Many of them have been doing things that are, let's say, questionable. Buying back your own shares on the stock exchange. Means that shareholders are making big gains, and companies that have been aided by the government have been buying back shares, and so they've been good for their shareholders. You might say, yeah, what did they do with their profits? Banks continued with bonuses, which they were heavily criticized for in the financial crisis of 2008. And so many companies have continued to do things that are, let's say, a bit unethical or highly unethical, and that's of course problematic. It's clear, I think. Okay, any more?
Yeah, I just put one again there. How will the IMF bail out the EU, considering the Asian economies have been hit more by COVID-19? And will the EU impose sanctions on China after the Chinese virus has devastated the EU?
Oh, I don't think the EU will introduce China sanctions. I don't see that happening. Now, how will the IMF bail out the EU? Well, at the moment, there's no need for an IMF bailout of the EU. I don't think that issue is on the table. If it is on the table, then you can be sure that the European Union has quite a lot of even this coronavirus has quite a lot of power, because if the plans go ahead as are presented in May, then the European Union would be good for 25, I think, 24 to 25% of all investments in the European Union. That's an enormous amount of money we're then talking about, and that would, I think, be enough to bail us ourselves out. So we would probably not need IMF bailout. Now, Asian economies have been hit very badly by the COVID crisis, yes. I have not clearly on my eyeballs what IMF has done to bail them out. So I can't really give you a reply there. All right. That was the last question, I think.
Yeah, there was one. How has the COVID-19 affected European banks generally?
Well, as I said, banks in different countries have different strengths, right? Italian banks have comparatively a large amount of non-performing loans, which is dangerous. Yeah, we will have to wait and see how bad this becomes or is. There's very little we can say about that at the moment. But it's not good if you have many non-performing loans, obviously. All right.
Professor, I have a question. May I ask?
Yes, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I have a question. Like I'm working currently in automotive industry, and the automotive industry, those are hit first when there is any epidemic, and the second is like, for instance, airline. How these industry can sustain, how long they can sustain in this kind of situation. And
both airlines and the automobile industry have been hit very hard. The automobile industry also, because there's another crisis going on in that sector, right? You have the whole movement to greening, electric cars, etc. So there's some very important shifts going on in that sector. On top of that, And it's not clear if all companies are able to cope very well with those shifts, right? Like Volkswagen, will they be able to make the change to electric? And then on top of that comes the pandemic. And now I'm sure that these companies could be, surviving for a year, 2 years maybe, but it shouldn't last much longer. We might then see very well quickly, a year from now, see shakeout in the airline sector. KLM believes that if things go as predicted by the European Commission, you saw the slides that I presented at the beginning, GDP. So deep cut this year, and then next year there's a sort of recovery. If things go like that, KLM expects to need at least 3 years before they are back to where they were at the beginning of this year. So that is a long time. And they think that with the government support that they have obtained, they'll be able to hang out for 3 years. Yeah, but you may very well find that some cheap airlines or something like that who have less flesh on the bones will not make it and go bankrupt without government support.